Hi everyone, I am Professor Dr. Murat Erdogan from Istanbul, Turkish German University. I was a very long time at Hacettepe University in Ankara. For my PhD, I was in Germany, in Freiburg, Bonn, and the last station of mine was Berlin. I worked also around 2 years in Turkish embassy in the press department. And my subject field is mostly migration and refugees. And my concentration is Turkish-EU relationship, migration, a part of these relations, also Turkish diaspora. Of course, we have a new challenge in Turkey last 10 years, and it makes also effect to the academia. And then a lot of academics, also me, we are working on also refugee issue in Turkey. I am a director of Migration and Integration Research Center at Turkish German University in Istanbul. It's a public university, around 10 years old, and our official opening ceremony, actually campus ceremony, was last year with Angela Merkel and Recep Tayyip Erdogan together. It's a new and small university. If you think about the Turkey, only 2,000 students we have, and then our capacity is also 5,000, and then we don't want to have more. And our language is German, education language is German. If you have interest, of course, you can come to Istanbul after COVID. And we have also MA program, and we are ready also for a PhD program at our university about the political science and Europe. For today, we are talking about the migration and Corona, but specifically Turkey and then refugees in Turkey. Turkey is a country hosts the biggest number of the refugees in the world. The refugee number in Turkey is now more than 4 million. I will also explain some details. I prepared a PowerPoint presentation, and after me, you will have more information and in global context from Kemal Kirisci. Kemal Kirisci is one of the best in this field. He is in Brookings now, and then before Brookings, he was at Boğaziçi University. And I have always huge respect to him, and he will give, I'm sure, very important information. And then, unfortunately, I cannot join the discussion part, but you can also ask your question to Kemal Hoca. I'm sure you have all information. I don't want to give you basic information, but this figure is my figure, and then I want to explain what does it mean human mobility, and what does it mean migration, what does it mean irregular migration, and what does it mean refugees. Turkey has all kind of this migration issue at center, and because of that, very interesting country. We have domestic or internal migration in Turkey. It is huge. You cannot imagine. You live in Germany, for example. You can also imagine 25 years ago, what was the population in your city, and then what is now. I was 25 years ago in Freiburg, and the population was 220,000. And I was also 6 months ago, one more time in Freiburg, and then population was almost the same. But you can not see the same picture in Turkey. 25 years ago in Istanbul, we had 9 million population, now over 16 million. Or Şanlıurfa was only 400,000, now over 2 million. All the cities, as you know, our population, I mean Turkey and then Germany is very similar, but 85 millions. But in Germany, I think the more than 1 million population cities is only 4 or 5. But in Turkey, we have more than 21. It is a dynamic of Turkish society, dynamic of Turkish economy also. but it makes easy to accept newcomers. It's also very important sociological background. I'm talking about not too much emotional things, the religion or cultural similarities, etc., etc. But for me, important is this sociological background. Internal or domestic migration in Turkey is very important. We should notice that. And refugees, of course, we have also in all time in Turkey refugees. It was also very interesting in Turkey's a lot Jewish academics. They have to come to Turkey, and then they give a lot contribution to Turkish academy, and they were also refugees. Turkey's geography, you know that we have instable region, and we have always such kind of mass migration or refugee issue. And we have also another experience, as you know, we have also Turkish diaspora. Now we call them as Turkish diaspora. It was also migration, very typical guest worker migration, but it brings also a lot experience for Turkish society. UNHCR announced latest figures about the refugees and the migrants, etc., etc. As you know, UNHCR is mostly concentrated on the refugees, but IOM and other UN institutions, they are concentrated on the migration. But you can see both the figures. And we know that migration is very important, especially for the developed countries. They need human capacity, they need people. It was a very typical issue. The Turks, 60s, in the 60s, they went to Germany from Turkey, and now they have a huge community in Germany. It was a need for the German economy. It was a need for the Turkish workers. They find jobs and then money. They establish their life, etc., etc. But refugee issue is very complicated and very traumatic issue. You can see also very clearly in the world. In the world, we have over 270 million migrants. Where they live, if you look at, they live mostly in very developed countries, as US, as Germany, as Saudi Arabia, or as France, etc., etc. The migrants is mostly welcome. Of course, there are also a lot of discussion about the migration, migrants, and then we have new parties against the migrants, etc., etc. There is another discussion, but the beginning of the process, it's a need for both sides. But if we talk about the refugees, the picture is totally changed. Around 80 million refugees we have. I mean, forced displaced people. 25 million, over 25 million has a refugee status, but the others is also for us asylum seekers or stateless, etc., etc. The other status, but altogether around 80 million refugees in the world. Okay, where they live, if you look at the refugees, you can see the change or differences between the refugees and non-migrants. They live, I mean, the refugees, mostly neighboring countries, mostly very poor countries. And it's also another dramatic. More than 85% of refugees, they live very, very poor countries and neighboring countries. As you know, we have a universal principle to open door policy. If you have a problem in your neighbors, you should open the barriers and doors for the refugees. Okay, but it's also very dramatically. If you open your doors, they came for temporary and limited time, but the reality is another. As we know, the refugees cannot go back easily, and then more than 80, more than 90%, they stay these countries. And then we have this reality in our world. For the Syrians in Turkey, 2011, the first group came to Turkey, and then everybody thought that it's a very short-term problems, and then they will go back, etc., etc. But it was not in the case, and then we have now more than 4 million refugees. I know the refugees issue, we discuss also responsibility sharing, burden sharing in global case, but unfortunately it is not easy, especially after the Berlin Wall. I mean, the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, we have another word, and then now it is very exceptional cases. We see also some war between the countries, but we have war, we have disaster in a countries, and other terrorist groups or another small groups, they fight each other, etc., etc. But the most dangerous issue, as you see also in this slide, the most important or problematic issue for the developed countries is refugees. How can we control the refugees? It is the most important question. As I say, the beginning of my speech, we have a very strong internal or domestic migration in Turkey. All last 5 years, each year we have more than 3 million domestic migrants in Turkey. They are coming from, for example, from Ağrı to Istanbul, from Van to Bursa, from Rize to Antalya, etc., etc. This is a huge mobility. It is also a character of Turkish society. We cannot forget it. And one more time about the Turkish migrant, we estimated Turkish citizens and Turkish background European citizens we have in Europe, but estimation is around 6.5 million, only in Germany more than 3 million. But it is also for us very important for Turkish society to understand the foreigner and migrant, what does it mean, discrimination, what does it mean, integration, etc., etc. We are talking about last days in Turkey about the integration of the Syrians in Turkish society, etc. Of course, we have also another experience in Germany with our own people, and it's also important. It's our geography, Turkey. It is, of course, very interesting location, but unfortunately, we are unstable countries around Turkey, and then it makes also the huge migration of refugee flow direction to Turkey. Forced migration is a reality, and every day we have more. If you compare 2000 and then 2020, you can see the number of the refugees is doubled. And unfortunately, this reality will also continue. It looks like. What does it? Why we are talking about refugees in Turkey? Not only in Turkey but also Germany, because there is a disaster in many different parts of the world. But in Syria, since 2011, more than 400,000 people killed, more than 13 million Syrians have to leave from the residence, and 6.5 million Syrians had to leave their country. I'm doing so-called Syrian barometer survey in Turkey. I'm doing also the same time for Turks in European countries, Euro-Turks barometer survey. Now, today, our subject is refugees and then Syrian, and because of that, I want to mention. And then I'm doing this survey in each year with UNHCR together, and then finish the 2019 version. It is very comprehensive survey where Turks and then Syrians, and then I'm trying to understand the situation, social situation, psychological situation between the two community, because it's a huge challenge for us. And the integration issue is not easy. As you know, in Germany, for example, integration for Turks began after 25 years in 80s, because integration is a little bit risky. If you make an integration policy, you can also give a more motivation for the newcomers to stay forever. And because of that, the states, they don't want to make
especially the beginning of the process integration policy. I'm trying to explain the issue about the Syrian refugees. I'm doing a lot surveys in this framework. If you have interest, you can also visit my website, and then mostly in Turkish, in English, some of them also in German. You can find economical aspect, educational aspect, livelihood, media, and then history, local governments, etc., etc. I say already the figures, the refugee figures, it's very new from UNHCR. And as I said, that more than 85% of the refugees, they live in developing poor countries. The other 15% is developed rich countries. The other figure, the small one, is Syrian, where they live in Syrian refugees. If you look at the figures, you can see also the same figure. 15% live in European countries, very little numbers in Canada or US, etc., etc. But the huge number is in Turkey, Lebanon, German, etc. And this burden sharing or responsibility sharing is also another problem in Europe. We know that the most refugee hosting country is Germany in Europe. More than 1.1 million. It's also a new figure of UNHCR. And then Germany is last 3 years in this top 10 list. Like the other countries, as Lebanon, Sudan, Jordan, Ethiopia, Uganda, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Iran, they are all very poor and very problematic countries. Okay, Turkey, we cannot say them as a poor country, but the capacity is limited. As you know, we have also huge problems, economic problems, etc., etc. And Germany is one of only one developed countries in the top 10 list. Why is that? We said that Turkey is since 2014 the biggest refugee hosting country. But if you look at 2011, the refugees, I mean, from Syrian, they arrived to Turkey 2011, the first group, and then the all international protection holders in Turkey, we had only 58,000, but now we are talking about over 4 million people. You can see also in this graphic in 2011, only 58,000 refugees in Turkey in all groups. As you know, we have also another geographical limitation in Turkey because of that. We call them as not refugee, but international protection or temporary protection status, etc., etc. It's a very complicated issue. I don't want to give more time for that. Maybe Kemal also mentioned that. And we have Syrian refugees, but after 2011, we have also non-Syrian refugees also under a very, very huge number. The non-Syrian numbers is now in Turkey is over 360,000, and it makes over 4 million refugees in Turkey, and it is really huge challenge for Turkish society. And the last number of the Syrian refugees in Turkey is 3,580,000 around. It makes, as you know, the Turkish population is 83 million, and it makes 4.36% of Turkish population. And we have also another numbers. For example, we have Syrian refugees, but the number 2 is Afghani refugees, Iraqi refugees, Irani refugees. These numbers is every day bigger than before, and I think we will have also in our future more numbers. It's also a very interesting figure. Since 2011, we have almost more than 9 years with Syrians in Turkey. More than 550,000 babies, Syrian babies, were born in Turkey. Between 2011 2015, 118,000. 2016, 82,000. 17, 111,000. 18, 113,000, and 19, 7,000. 2020, last 5 months, the numbers was 38,000 new babies. It makes a huge number, and I mean, we have not only refugees from our borders, but also in our country. Their status is also a little bit complicated. And they are in Turkey, but normally they are citizens of Syrian Arab Republic. But the Syrian Arab Republic give no paper for them, and because of that, Turkish government give also no citizenship as US. We are also the similar system in Germany, and because of that, they have also risk as a stateless. Anyway, these numbers make also very huge differences and very huge developments. I mean, the numbers in Turkish society. Daily born babies in Turkey around 250 to 300. We have different status of the Syrians in Turkey, and the Turkish government gives citizenship to the Syrians. Some Syrians is around 120,000. It is a huge number actually. If you compare the Turkish migrants in Germany, they have more time spent in Germany, but you can also imagine, and then you can also check how many was after 10 years, how many citizenship gave the German government to the Turks. I think it was less than 5,000. Now 120,000 citizens. We have also Syrians who have residence permits. They live in Turkey. They have another status around 120,000 also as the citizens numbers. And the huge number is, of course, under temporary protection status. And only if you look at these figures, the number is over, actually, only Syrians number is almost 4 million. Of course, they have some of them get the citizenship, but you can also imagine in Germany, some of them stay or seen always as their original country, as Turks in Germany. In Turkey, we have 81 provinces, and the Syrians live in all provinces. It is also another reality. But more importantly, we had the beginning of the process, the first 6 years, refugee camps in Turkey. The number of the refugee camps was 26, and then capacity was also around 300,000. And it was very important for the refugees. But then the Turkish government decided not establish new refugee camps, because refugee camps as a temporary issue, you cannot stay forever in the refugee camps. It's also not easy to manage, and then it's very costly. And then Turkish government has another policy. Actually, it is not directly a policy, but they let them move in Turkey. And then suddenly we see all the Syrians in all parts of the Turkey, and then very different numbers. As you know, you have in Germany very nice system, so-called COHESION. But we have no such kind of system. We have no settlement system in Turkey, and because of that, we have very different numbers. And then if you look at the numbers, for example, Kilis, Hatay, Şanlıurfa, Gaziantep, they have huge number. And then the average of Turkey is 4.3, but if you look at the Kilis, the refugee numbers reach 80%, and then Hatay 26%, Şanlıurfa 21%, etc., etc. And then the refugees in refugee camps number is only 60,000. It makes less than 2% of Syrians in Turkey. I mean, we live with Syrians together in big cities. They are urban refugees now, and then they live with Turkish society together. Very imbalance between the cities, not only between the cities, but also the provinces. For example, in Istanbul, we have 39 provinces. In each province, we have another numbers of the Syrians. For example, in Beşiktaş, it's very famous. I'm sure most of them, you know that Beşiktaş is a huge province in Turkey. I'm sure more than 1 million population, but how many Syrians registered in Beşiktaş? If you look at it, is under 100. But if you look at the other provinces as Sultanbeyli, Sultan Gazi, Esenyurt, etc., Fatih, you can see more than 50,000, 70,000, even 90,000. But is it good or not? Bad? It is another discussion topic. Actually, systematic would be good, and then the burden sharing also in Turkey would be better. It's a huge burden for the local governments. Actually, it will be maybe easy. But another issue, if you look at the refugees, they are very happy for that. I mean, they can choose, I mean, they could choose no more their own place to settle or to live. And then it makes easy for the integration. It's also next future, we will also discuss that. I mean, which one is better, the system in Germany or system without system and settlement in Turkey? It's also another academic discussion. We have, of course, a lot of children. As I said, more than 550,000 were born in Turkey. And if you look at the Syrian children between 5 to 7 years old, I mean the school age children, it is more than 1 million. And then it's a huge success actually of Turkish government. More than 650,000, they have opportunity to go to school and also public schools. At the beginning of the process, the first 5 years, they visit Arabic schools in Turkey, so-called temporary education centers, and with Syrian curriculum, because the expectation was very clearly they should go back, and then, of course, why should they learn Turkish? But then the Turkish government decided to give them Turkish courses and Turkish public schools. It is also very huge issue, because if you look at this number, you need establish new around 1,500 schools. You need extra 50,000 teachers. It is really huge challenge for the whole Turkish education system, and it makes also social conflict if you not give enough resource. Then local population give more reaction. You can also see here we need really a lot schools, more than 1,500, but the plan is next 2 years is only 200. You cannot establish easily the schools, especially in city centers. It is another challenge for Turkish society. It's a very good figure of Turkish universities. It is actually the numbers is not enough actual. The last number is 33,000 Syrians visit Turkish universities now in Turkey. It is for me very important and very strategic issue, because the huge population of Syrians, I mean over 3.6 million, in my observation and then my experience, I am saying that since 2014, they will stay forever in Turkey. Okay, some part of they can go European countries, or very little part of they can go back maybe to Syria or another countries, but the huge part of them, more than 80%, they will stay forever in Turkey, and we will live together. It is not important we wish that or not. It's a reality. And because of that, we need also social bridges. We need also intellectuals. We need also some role models, etc. It is the university students. I think it is very important to have over 33 thousand university students Syrian universities and Turkish universities. I'm at Turkish German University. We have also around 50 Syrian university students. They learn Turkish, they learn Arabic, of course, their language, but also they have to learn also German and English, and they are also relatively very successfully. And economic aspect is also another discussion topic. I have to check also my time. Okay, I will finish in 5 minutes, I hope. It's also a very important issue. What's the situation in Turkey about the livelihoods, economic inclusion? In Turkey, the Syrian refugees money from EU. I mean, it's a famous 3.3 plus 3 billion euro. Till now, the EU spent for this project around 1 billion euros. But only 1.5 million Syrians and 200,000 non-Syrian refugees get this money. How much this money? It is per month 120 Turkish lira. It makes less than 20 euro per month and per person. Of course, they cannot leave this money, but it's a good money if they have a family, 8 person, 120 Turkish lira, it makes around 1,000 Turkish lira. They can pay their rent, their electricity, etc., etc. But it's very important, very essential, but it covers only around 30% of the Syrians in Turkey. The others, they have to work. I mean, these people, they have to also work, but if they not get this money, they have no other opportunity. In my survey, we can also see very clearly the Syrians work in Turkey, of course, as a informal worker. More than 38% of Syrians work already. It makes around 1 million Syrians. 1 million Syrians work in Turkey as an informal. Of course, it's also another discussion topic in European countries. They don't want to have any refugees. But if the refugees in Turkey and then work, and then they discuss and then criticize the Turkish government why they work informal. And please don't forget, Turkish economy, one of the important points of the Turkish economy is informality, unfortunately. It is not only for refugees, but also for Turkish workers. You can also check in Turkish Statistics Institute, over 30% of Turkish economy is informal. In Turkey, we have 32 million Turkish workers in Turkish economy, 32 million. And more than 10 million, they work already informal. Of course, for the refugees, it is, they had no other opportunity. But I have another thesis as the domestic migration. At the beginning of my speech, I said that the refugees had 2 chances in Turkey. One, the Turkish society accept them. And I think it's very important, this internal mobility, it was easy to accept newcomers. It's very important. Very dynamic society can also accept newcomers easily. But stable societies as European countries, it's very hard. And the number 2 is informal economy. Informal economy give also opportunity for the Syrians to work, to establish their life with their own effort. But it is also absurd to say that, oh, it's good to the Syrian give the Turkish economy income and the Turkish state or Turkish economy use them as a cheap worker, etc. Okay, it could be, but you can maybe easily imagine if they not come to Turkey, how much would be cost, and then what is their benefit? It's another absurd discussion subject. But it is important they work already in Turkey, they establish their life, and it is really very important for their integration process. And in Turkey, we have more than 14% unemployment rate, more than 4.5 million Turks waiting for workplaces. And for workplaces, creation of workplaces is very, very huge problem, and it is not easy today make it. Okay, and last 2 points, and then I will also talk 1 minute about also the corona, and then I will also finish. As you know, we have a discussion with EU about this Turkish EU deal 2016, and the solution was very simple. EU should give us money, and then we should keep them in Turkey. I think the most attractive refugee for the Europeans is refugee happy in Turkey. It is so simple. It was a very clearly externalization policy, a security, cost, and integration externalization. And then what was the Turkish reaction, or the reaction of the Turkish society and government? It was instrumentalization, and it will also going on next future. But discussion about the cost of the refugees is always a very huge topic. Of course, the EU gives the most important money, or huge money, to Turkey. But if you think about the refugee cost and then the other risk, you can also think about, is that really too much or not? There is, I give this figure always. There is a survey of Köln University, and they make a calculation, and they said that a refugee cost for Germany 15,000 euro per year. Okay, and I made a simulation. If the Syrian refugees were not in Turkey but in Germany, how much would be cost for the Germany? You can see the numbers: over 265 billion euros, plus around 570,000 Syrians. I mean, it includes only Turkish Syrians in Turkey, not in Germany. Anyway, it is absurd numbers, but the numbers is, I mean, the cost of the refugees is not only money. If you think about only the money, it's a huge mistake. You can have a lot of money, but even for that, you don't want to have refugees. I can give you an example. If the Turkish government said that EU gives to Turkey per year 1.5 billion euros, as you know, for 4 years 6 billion, per year 1.5 million. If Turkish government said that, please send us this money, no more, we will give you money per year 20 billions per year, and then we will give you 10 years. I mean, altogether 200 billions euro will give to Europeans, but with a condition: you should take 1 million, not 4, only 1 million refugees from Turkey. Can any European countries or EU accept that? You can give the answer yourself. It shows us the money is a small part of the whole issue. Refugees is always a topic for security, for topic for the social cohesion, topic for economy, etc., etc. Because of that, this discussion is also absurd. I mean, the EU give a lot of money to Turkey, etc., etc. Okay, but it is if we think about and then believe the responsible sharing or burden sharing, you should also think about these figures. We have a new environment in Turkey, a lot of cooperation. Actually, it would be good cooperation with EU, but EU forget very important topic as Turkish EU custom union, or visa liberalization, or access process, etc., etc. The political issue, because of the political situation in Turkey, I can accept. I mean, the problems is huge, and it's not easy to go this direction. But anyway, it was not only money, and then it was not only the refugees, but the other issue. Okay, last point about the social cohesion. It is my thesis always: the Turkish society give a lot support, and then social acceptance level in Turkey is extremely high, even today. Okay, the reactions we have, problems we have, but don't forget, it is really a social shock, and then suddenly we have from 58 to over 4 million refugees. It is not easy to manage. But the Turkish society ready to support the Syrians and the other refugees, but they are not ready to share their future with them. It's a huge challenge next future. There are some integration models, etc., etc. I'm working on it. It is every day. It's Turkish. Every day is more complicated. It is not easy, the integration issue, and then it is some problems, etc. It is my last book. Next week it will be published in Turkish, in English, and then Arabic, and you can reach also in online. We are almost the final of this process. Now I'm talking about the last point about the coronavirus and the refugees. It was a huge problem actually, and then I had also a big worry for that. But till now, the numbers show us the refugees affected not too much. We have not numbers, but I have my own information with DGMM in Turkey and then the other institution, etc., etc. It is general problems in Turkish society is also the same effect to the refugees. Of course, a lot UN institutions, NGOs, INGOs, they give a lot of effort for information, for hygiene, for the other medical support, etc., etc. But the Syrians' chance is they are mostly very young, and they have experience for challenge, very bad condition, etc., etc. I think it helps also. It helps to Syrians. It helps also Turkish society. We talk with Kemal Hoca, and then we also, as you know, we have also an article. We invite the EU to give the contribution for this challenge. It is not easy. It is also for social cohesion very important. If the Turkish society see or think about that, because of the Syrian refugees or the other refugees, we have more problem with the corona, etc. It will be also not good, and then it will be also not easy to stop this kind of discussion. And because of that, EU should also give extra support for this COVID issue. I can stop here. I'm sure Kemal Hoca will give more important and then more global aspect of whole issue with international organization. I want to give you a picture about the refugees and then especially Syrian refugees in Turkey. And I wish you all the best, and I hope it will be also for you interesting. Thank you very much.
I hope you're all doing fine in these very difficult times. What I'm going to do, I already mentioned this to Kubilay, I'm going to try to cover 4 topics. And unlike Murat Hoca, I don't have a PowerPoint presentation. The technological aspect of these things is just too challenging for me. The first point will be on how the COVID-19 pandemic is impacting refugees. And second point is how this is occurring at a time when the traditional refugee protection system is broken. Third point, what has the international community done so far to try to repair this broken system? And finally, what are the challenges moving ahead in managing the refugee protection system? I was hoping to cover also a little bit how Turkey fits into all this, but I think Murat Hoca has covered the topic quite extensively. And I'm also hoping to do this in 25-30 minutes, if I can. You know, Turkish professors have a reputation for talking too much and not delivering their promise as far as time goes. But I genuinely do want to have a Q&A session, questions and answers. And at any point, please feel free to interrupt me for clarification purposes. Here we go. I am assuming I had a quick look at Murat Hoca's presentation, PowerPoint presentation. I only came in towards the end of it, but I believe at the start of his presentation, he did talk about the refugees issue globally. And this is captured each year by the report that UNHCR prepares and launches on the World Refugee Day, which was last Saturday. And I'm assuming you are familiar with the numbers and the broad challenges that the topic faces. So I'm going to take a nosedive into how COVID has impacted refugees, the COVID crisis. And with that in mind, I shared with Kubilay a number of links. And one of those links is a report that was prepared by the International Rescue Committee. It's a committee, interestingly, not many people know about it, about the fact that the committee was set up right after the Second World War to manage and help with the refugee crisis at the time, and particularly the resettlement of people who had been displaced as a result of the Second World War. And today the committee is led by a former British Minister of Foreign Affairs, David Miliband, a name that you may be familiar with. And they have a really very good report which talks about how the COVID-19 pandemic has created a double emergency. The first emergency results from the increased vulnerability of refugees because of the virus. And that vulnerability is a function of the fact that people who find themselves in crowded circumstances, poor housing, with little access to water. As you know, we are constantly being reminded that we need to wash our hands regularly. And refugees, as 85% of the refugees, according to the UNHCR's annual report, live in developing countries. And plus, they find themselves in the most difficult circumstances within developing countries. They don't have the access to washing facilities, hygiene facilities, and sanitary facilities. That makes them particularly vulnerable to the effect of the virus. That's one side of the medallion. The other side of the medallion they talk about in this notion of a double emergency is based on the fact that most of the refugees in the world find themselves in countries and societies that are vulnerable in the first place. In what sense? Their health system often is in a precarious state. That is, in normal times, it is challenged to provide the necessary health support to society at large, let alone refugees. And secondly, they also point out, which Murat Hoca made references to, many refugees find themselves having to work in the informal economy to have access to livelihood means, to be able to survive day to day, pay for their rent, pay for their needs, basic needs, etc. And COVID-19, the nature of the pandemic is such that we've seen it is impacting national economies, but also the public services in those countries. This is what they argue is the double emergency that refugees face. I would add an additional emergency to it, if we could think of the medallion having a third face, and that's resulting from the fact that refugees or asylum seekers are finding it more and more difficult to access asylum and eventually become refugees, because the pandemic has led many countries to close their borders. And secondly, it has become even more difficult to benefit from resettlement possibilities, from moving into a third country where better protection prospects may exist. All right. Now, think about the situation in, Murat Hoca mentioned that more than 90% of refugees in Turkey live in urban centers, and they do encounter challenges there in the sense of the first phase of the medallion. But think about this huge refugee camp in Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh, where around 800,000 refugees are living in very crammed circumstances, but in poor topographic circumstances, but also in circumstances where there's hardly any running water. And that you would think would be an ideal environment for the transmission and spread of the virus, let alone cope with the health consequences created by the virus. However, what is interesting, as far as I know from my exposure to the literature, we do not yet have a solid fact-based assessment and analysis of how COVID-19 has impacted refugees. We do not have concrete figures on the number of cases amongst refugees compared to the number of cases in the broader population in the countries where they find themselves. We also don't have concrete information on the death rates amongst refugees. Murat Hoca made references to the Turkish experience. Turkey is a state with a reputation for keeping its information as close to its chest as possible. But Murat Hoca is a very resourceful person. He knows a lot of people in bureaucracy. And through him, I did learn how even the DGMM, that is the Directorate General for Migration Management, the bureaucracy that deals with migrants and refugees in Turkey, does not have access to that kind of information because the Ministry of Health is keeping the information very close to its chest. Now, it is interesting, the little information we have access to suggests that after all, there are not that many cases, and that COVID-19 seems to impact refugees less than they do the broader population. You would think that the government would be prepared by sharing this information with the public. But there is a classic saying in English that loose lips sink ships. So the Turkish government prefers to keep this information to itself. But see, this seems to be the case for the rest of the world as well. So we still are not very sure of the details of how far the virus is impacting the actual health of refugees. However, we are very well aware that the impact that the virus is having on the economies of these countries and on the global economy at large is going to adversely affect the lives of refugees as we move forward. Now I come to the second point I'd like to make and share with you, that this is happening, that is the crisis, the pandemic is happening at a time when the classic international refugee system had been broken for some time. With that in mind, I shared with Kubilay the link to a book by two leading professors of refugee studies, Alexander Betts and Pierre Collier, called Refuge, the Transformation of a Broken System. I can't remember the exact title of the book. And in that book, you should be able to explore the details of what makes the system broken and what the original system is. So I will very briefly summarize those. The classic system, the prevailing system, is based on the Geneva Convention relating to the status of refugees that was adopted in 1951 on the experience of displacement resulting from the Second World War. And the convention defines who a refugee is. I assume you're familiar with it. I won't go into the details of it, but very, very basic definition is someone fleeing into a third country because the state that it belongs to is persecuting the person on the basis of their racial, national, ethnic identity, or social status and political opinion that it may be holding. You have, according to the UN Convention on Civil Rights, the right to access an asylum procedure, but you are not automatically entitled to be recognized as a refugee. But once you are recognized as a refugee, you are entitled, or the convention presumes that there are three durable solutions. One of those durable solutions is that you return, or the preferred durable solution is that at some point you are able to return voluntarily and in a sustainable manner to the country from where you had to flee. The second durable solution is based on the idea that you stay in the country where you are and you become integrated into it and eventually a citizen of that country. In Europe, for example, you will come across more and more second generation of refugees who fled the Soviet Union or the Soviet bloc. For example, Hungarians that fled the Hungarian uprising in 1956, or the Czechoslovak one, this famous Spring of Prague in 1968. You will, for example, when I, having completed my degree at Boğaziçi University in 1976, I found myself in Stockholm to do some graduate work and work as well. And I was quite puzzled to find that there were many Chileans from what happened in Chile in the 1970s. And many of these people became locally integrated and they've become citizens. We see that in the United States as well. And some of them have risen to very high ranks in government. The third solution, durable solution, is to get resettled into a third country. Throughout my career, I studied refugee issue in Turkey from roughly 1989 to 2013. And for a very long time, especially during the Cold War, overwhelming majority of refugees in Turkey were resettled mostly to the United States, some to Canada and other countries, eventually to European countries too, like Germany or Finland or Sweden. Now, this system is considered to be broken today. Why is it considered to be broken? Because firstly, refugees increasingly find themselves in what is in refugee language referred to as protracted situations. And the United Nations defines a protracted situation as a situation where refugees have been in more than 5 years of displacement, that at the end of their 5 years of displacement, they still remain displaced, and it's not very clear where they're going to find themselves. And an overwhelming majority of refugees find themselves in long, protracted situations. The average year depends on how you measure these things, but they are often more than 10 years. And of course, there is the case of the Palestinians that have now been in a protracted situation for more than 3 generations. You have Afghans who find themselves in a similar situation, and Syrian refugees are now in a protracted situation as their displacement first started in 2011. Resettlement that used to be one durable solution, effective durable solution, has also collapsed. I won't go into the details of it, but United States is a very good example. Obama, for example, was the previous president that had actually increased the quota for US resettlements, whereas the new administration has adopted the exact opposite and has shrunk the numbers. Just to give you an idea, there were only 25 Syrian refugees resettled in the United States in 2019. And this applies to many other traditional resettlement countries. So before the pandemic occurred, the most governments, especially in the West, were closing the doors to resettlement. And I won't go into the details of why this was occurring, but it had a lot to do with politics in these countries moving to the right and populist leaders abusing or exploiting the issue of refugees. Local integration has also been problematic in the sense that the kinds of political dynamics that has adversely affected the resettlement prospects, but also the prospects of accepting asylum seekers in Western countries, including the European Union. And Murat Hoca made some references to it. And with now the pandemic culminating in the closure of borders, the same dynamics are occurring in countries where most refugees find themselves in, including in Turkey. And Murat Hoca gave some elements of why this is the case. And often it's local populations resisting the presence of refugees, and the failure of governments and maybe the international community too in nurturing, in encouraging social cohesion. And again, I may have missed that part of it, but Murat Erdogan, in his own studies and public opinion surveys, as well as other surveys, show, like elsewhere in the world, the conviction, rightly, wrongly, amongst the public that refugees are taking away jobs from local people, and that refugees are burdening the public services such as health and education in the countries they find themselves. So local integration, you saw how low the number of Syrian refugees that have been granted citizenship is in Turkey. That applies to Lebanon too, as far as Syrian refugees goes. There are solid historical reasons why the Lebanese authorities are so nervous and reluctant to let Syrian refugees become integrated. Same applies to Jordan as well. And we can extend that same observation for example, Afghans in Pakistan or Afghans in Iran, not to mention Somalians in Sudan, in Kenya, Congolese in Uganda, etc. So without abusing your time too much, I want to underline how the system that was set up in 1951 with the Geneva Convention, which is binding on signatory states, is effectively broken. And that brokenness, according to the book I made references to, hit the world, hit the international community, and especially Europe during the 2015-16 migration crisis. I won't go into the details. I'm sure you're very familiar with, especially most of you being from Germany. But many analysts have concluded that one of the reasons why this crisis erupted is because Europe, but also international community at large, failed to live up to the traditional refugee protection system, one of whose important pillars is burden sharing. The notion that the protection of refugees is an international responsibility, not solely the responsibility of the country where the refugees happen to find themselves in. And the migration crisis of the time, 2015 and 16, was attributed, amongst other reasons, to this particular factor there. That's my second point. Now my third point. What did the international community do? The international community, I am tempted to argue, responded quite quickly and effectively to the 2015-16 crisis. Maybe there was a recognition that that crisis was really shaking the European Union, a project that had been successful so far, coming on the heels of the disaster of the Second World War, from its foundations. You might recall how the Schengen system was temporarily suspended with many negative consequences, including in terms of trade, not to mention in terms of movement of people. The end result of it was the holding of a summit in New York City in September 2016. And from that summit emerged a commitment and a political process that culminated in the adoption of the Global Compact on Refugees in December 2018. I will spare the details of the journey, the diplomatic and political journey from September 2016 to December 2018, and instead focus on what the Global Compact on Refugees is saying before I move on to my fourth point. One important aspect of the compact compared to the Geneva Convention of 1951 is that it is not legally binding, right? So the compact and the recommendations of the compact are what they are. They are just recommendations. But I and many other people believe that the compact carries a moral weight on the international community and on countries that have signed to it. All members of the European Union with the exception, and this may not come as a surprise to you, of Hungary, have signed the compact, and I believe that brings on those members a weight to support the compact. Unfortunately, the United States is one of the few countries, together with Hungary, that has not signed the compact. What does the compact say and recommend to the international community to fix the broken system, or at least to manage its brokenness? First of all, the compact recognizes that there are problems with durable solutions. It recognizes that most refugees find themselves in protracted situations and find themselves in developing countries, 85% of them. And because it recognizes that durable solutions is not, has become very difficult to achieve, interestingly, it puts the emphasis on strengthening the self-reliance of refugees and the resilience of host communities. So what it is saying is to the international community is we recognize that most refugees are stuck in developing countries and that the international community is failing to provide the necessary support for refugees to be able to survive. We should help these countries, host countries, to enable these refugees to stand on their own feet. And not only to stand on their own feet by providing them access to livelihood opportunities. And livelihood opportunities is a very, very politically correct way of saying providing them employment, of course, preferably formal employment, but also enabling refugees to set up their own businesses. Right? I am someone who has great admiration for diplomacy and diplomacy's ability to come up with concepts and words that make it a little bit easier for politicians and statespeople, men and women, to sell those ideas to their publics. The compact also says clearly that the burden on host countries should be lightened and thinned out. And one way of doing this is introducing the notion of resilience of host communities, a notion that did not exist in the Geneva Convention. Interestingly, the Geneva Convention assumed that all states were a bit like Western states in the sense of they are strong states able to provide public services and fund those services as well. Whereas refugees find themselves in often very fragile states. So you need to support those states, but you also need to support the communities that refugees find themselves in. And that brings us back to the notion of social cohesion. And to do that, they argue the compact has a very interesting set of suggestions and ideas on how to move forward, including, for example, involving the private sector. Just in brackets, to give you an idea, for example, the Swedish multinational company IKEA has committed itself to employing refugees around the world. We see a number of companies who have taken up this call. It's not just governments, but also companies. And some of you who are familiar with the United States may also be familiar with this yogurt called Chobani. Okay, Chobani Greek yogurt. But the company is set up by a Turk of Kurdish origin who has been very successful, and in some ways, though never recognized formally as a refugee, he was someone who felt that he needed to move on from Turkey. I won't dwell on the details, but he did really well. I mean, amazingly well in the United States, and today pretty much dominates the yogurt sector in the United States. He, because of his background, he has become very committed to supporting immigrants as well as refugees, and founded a foundation called the 10th Foundation for Refugees. And they have been very active in promoting this idea that the private sector and big companies should make an extra effort in integrating refugees. So the idea very much comes from, is embedded in the Global Compact on Refugees, and this foundation has been very active in promoting it. One other aspect of the Global Compact on Refugees compared to the Geneva Convention is that it has set up a mechanism called the Global Refugee Forum to review how the compact is being implemented. And the compact, to cut a long story short, has provided ideas and mechanisms to overcome the challenges resulting from the failure of durable solutions or the system being broken. And as I come to my fourth point, the challenges vis-a-vis the implementation of the compact and the ideas of the compact, and how the pandemic has complicated this, is that the UNHCR and the UN system, and I have shared for you a link that details the measures that the United Nations and the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres, who incidentally used to be the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, has adopted a program for managing the impact of COVID-19. And the UN system, I know these days the UN is often criticized and criticized bitterly, but I wonder what the world today, in the specific case of the pandemic, but also in the specific case of the pandemic's impact on refugees, would look like if the UN and the UN system was not there. And when we look at the response of the UN system, we see that it's focused around the provision of emergency assistance and supporting the basic needs of refugees. And that particular document has the details. I don't want to take up more of your time. I'm realizing I'm coming to the end of my 30 minutes there. The EU, and I would be one of the first to criticize the EU bitterly for not doing enough, but it is also doing something. And as we talk, we're just having this lecture on the heels of what is known as the Brussels IV conference to support the humanitarian needs in Syria, inside Syria, but also outside Syria, supporting refugees. And they have just reached the decision of mobilizing an additional $5 billion corresponding to the euro version of it, to support these efforts inside and outside Syria to deal with the humanitarian crisis resulting from the pandemic. Now, I'm sorry, I'm realizing that I'm mixing the third and the fourth points there. One example I'd like to share with you a number of concrete examples resulting from the Global Compact. One very solid example that was born before actually the Compact was adopted, but at the time when the notion of the Compact was evolving. And there, if I may, I would like to make some publicity for a book we published at Brookings in April 2016 called The Consequences of Crisis in Syria, the Failure of the International Community to Protect. And in that book, we toyed with, in a very crude, rudimentary fashion, with the notion of a compact. And the person who prepared the report for the summit in New York in September 2016 was my co-author, Elizabeth Ferris. And we would like to think that some of the ideas in the compact kind of germinated out of this research project we had at Brookings at the time. And this coincided, that's the reason why I brought up this publicity, and I never gave the link to the book, but if you're interested, you can look it up. The title, Consequences of Chaos in Syria. The book was published right when the EU-Jordanian Compact was signed. And the logic behind the compact was that the Jordanian government would provide work permits for Syrian refugees, enable them to access formal employment in return for the European Union providing some trade concessions to Jordan, particularly in the textile industry, meaning make it easier for Jordanian companies to export goods to the European Union, and in return enable economic growth at home. Trade usually enables economic growth, and allow some of that growth to be used for the employment of Syrian refugees. And when you employ Syrian refugees, research shows, broader research shows that when you employ refugees consumption increases, which provides work for local people, but also refugees end up paying taxes and also contribute to social security funds in the countries they find themselves in, right? So that notion, in a recent work, I advocate, and I gave the link to it, it should be adopted by European Union and Turkey as they are considering to revisit the EU-Turkey deal from March 2016. Similar notions of compact are being discussed for Bangladesh as well as for Ethiopia, that hosts Somalian and Sudanese refugees. The Ethiopian government has opened its labor market, but now you need funds and support to the Ethiopian government and the Bangladeshi government to be able to generate the circumstances that would allow the employment of refugees. Now, having made this remark, I remembered that when discussing the Global Compact on refugees, I failed to mention how the Compact advocates seeing refugees not just as a burden on the shoulders of host countries and the international community, which requires putting and transferring constantly funds that just disappear beyond providing basic needs. Why not think of refugees as also people that can contribute to the development of their host countries? And that's the context in which the compacts that I made references to become important. Just please 2 minutes, 3 minutes on the challenges moving ahead in implementing the compact, but also facing the consequences of the pandemic. Of course, the biggest challenge and the most disappointing challenge is that the international community is failing to resolve the conflicts that are provoking the movement, the displacement of people. A good example for that is the situation in Syria, not to mention the one in Afghanistan, the one in South Sudan and Somalia, etc. Unfortunately, the international community finds itself in a state, in a very divided state, where it's failing to resolve those conflicts, to enable refugees to return. Another challenge is that, and you may disagree with me on that, the international liberal order that gave birth to the Geneva Convention, but not to mention also the World Bank, the IMF, the OECD, and the European Union, right, is weakening. And one of the reasons why it's weakening is what is happening a couple of miles away from where I am right now at the White House in Washington, DC. And it is happening at a time when alternative powers are emerging, like China and Russia. Now, there is an excellent website managed by OCHA, the UN Office for Coordinating Humanitarian Assistance, called the Financial Tracking Services, FTS. And FTS is very transparent, and it lists the funding support that countries in the world provide. And you will see there is not 1 cent or ruble that comes from Russia, or I don't know what the name of the Chinese currency is, from China to this common fund in supporting refugees and humanitarian assistance around the world. Professor, I just saw you looking at your watch. I get the point. Now that world order is weakening, but simultaneously, Western countries that had played such an important role in supporting the system is moving to the right, by and large. And that explains in many ways why Hungary, for example, did not support the Global Compact on refugees. So that's going to be a challenge, an important challenge moving forward. I have a longer list of challenges, but I better stop here, and maybe we can come back to the topic in the Q&A. I believe we still have a little time for Q&A, according to my watch, at least a good 20 minutes rather than the 30 minutes I had promised. So I shut up here. And thank you for listening to me so patiently.